What's up, y'all? I'm Tom, and this is Like a Math Class. In this video, we're going to talk about the null factor law. The null factor law is a way that we can find the solutions to a quadratic equation or a quadratic function. What do the solutions mean? What is the null factor? Let's get to it and find out. Before we can find out what the null factor law means, we have to break down what is null and what is factor. Factors are two or more numbers that when multiplied together produce another number or expression. So in this case, the factors will be when we take our standard form equation and we put it into factored form. So let's start by putting this thing into factored form. What are two numbers that multiply together to give me -8 that add together to give me -2? Well, that's going to be y equals x minus 4 times x plus 2. Right? At some point you should be able to do this in your head without having to go through the whole factoring process. If you do need to review your factoring process, check out my other video where we go through that. So here we've got our two solutions, x minus 4 and x plus 2. So the null factor law, here's the null part. The null means if you've got two things that when you multiply them together and they equal 0, then either this piece has to equal 0 or this piece has to equal 0. Because of course, when you multiply two numbers together to get a result of 0, either one has to be 0 or the other has to be 0. In order for us to find the solutions are where y equals 0. That's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to find where's y equal to 0. Why are we trying to find where y equals 0? We're trying to find where these two things cross the x-axis. And at the x-axis, the y value is always 0. That's why we call this the solutions. Most of the time when you're working with quadratics, you want to know where crosses the x-axis, the vertex, or possibly where it crosses the y-axis, depending on the context of the situation that you're looking at. So we want to find where do these two things, where are these going to cross the x-axis. And as you can probably see, it's going to cross at 4 and -2, but how do we get that from here? Well, first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, well, x minus 4 has to equal 0, or x plus 2 has to equal 0. Because by the null factor law, either A, let's call this A, here's A, so either A has to equal 0, or B has to equal 0. B has to equal 0 or B has to equal 0. So when we work through this, we add 4 to both sides, so x has got to either equal 4 or x has to equal -2. That's where we get this -2 here. That's our red value that we just found. And over here at +4, that's our purple value that we just found. So we end up with x equals +4 or x equals -2. So those are our two solutions for this. And you know, as you work through these more, you'll see, okay, I know that these things are just going to be the opposite. But the key thing is this has to be equal to 0. You can't do this if you've got one parentheses times another parentheses equals 7. It doesn't work because just because you've got one thing times another doesn't mean it's always going to equal 7. But if you've got one thing times another and it equals 0, then you know for certain one of those two things has to equal 0. So it only works when your equation is equal to 0. Let's look at another one that's just slightly more complicated. Here we've got -1 times 16x plus 1 times x minus 4. Now, wait a minute. Before, just a second ago, you said just two parentheses. This thing's got some number out in front of it. What do we do now? Well, if you've got three numbers multiplied together, if you've got -1 times 2 times 3, let's just say, right, we're just looking at some basic multiplication, then we could either take 2 times 3, we could take -1 times 2, we could take -1 times 3. So to get this broken down where I've got two factors, I need to have two parentheses or two sets of parentheses. And I can't make -1 equal 0 because -1 doesn't equal 0. But what I can do is I can say, well, what if I've got -16x minus 1? And I just distribute this -1 across this parentheses. And then I've got x minus 4. And no, I don't do this across this parentheses and this across this parentheses, because that would be the same thing as over here. We know that this is going to be -6. But if I took this -1 and I multiplied it by this 2, and then I took this -1 and I multiplied it by this 3, I would end up with a +6, because I'd have a -2 times a -3, +6. That's not the answer. So we cannot take this -1 and distribute it over both of these things. We're only going to choose to do it with one of them. And you could choose to do it with the first one, or you could choose to do it with the second one. It doesn't matter. Now, when we find trying to find the null product of this, now we've got -16x minus 1 times x minus 4. So either -16x minus 1 has to equal 0, or x minus 4 has to equal 0. So in this case, let's start with the easy one. X is going to equal -4. Or if I add 1 to both sides, I've got -16x equals a +1. Divide by -16, and x equals a -1/16. And here are our two solutions for this problem. Now, let's just see what would happen if I did take that -1 and put it over the x minus 4. You probably already figured out that it's going to be the exact same thing. All that means is I would have 0 equals 16x plus 1 times -x plus 4, right? I've just taken this -1 and I've distributed it across here. -x, +4. So when I do the null factor law again, I've got 16x plus 1 equals 0, or -x plus 4 equals 0. All right, so again, I'm going to subtract my 1 from here. So I've got 16x equals -1. When I divide both sides by 16, I'm still going to end up with -1/16. And here, what I could do is I could subtract 4 and multiply both sides by negative, or I could just add the x to both sides. Either way, I'm going to end up with x equals a +4, which is what we have over here. So again, the null factor law, you're trying to get it into parentheses, right? You're trying to get it into complete chunks within the parentheses. And then you're setting your function equal to 0 to find all the solutions along the x-axis, where the graph crosses the x-axis. You could use this for a cubic function, a quartic function. You could do this for any type of function as long as you've got parentheses times parentheses times parentheses with nothing else on the outside. I hope that was helpful, and if it was, make sure you hit the like button. I'll see you in the next video.